This podcast is brought to you by the Albany Public Library main branch and the generosity of listeners like you. What is a podcast? God, Daddy, these people talk as much as you do. Razib Khan's Unsupervised Learning.
Hey everybody, the normal podcast for Unsupervised Learning has a guest, but this is a monologue, and since it is a monologue, I have decided that I'm not going to post the whole episode free. I will post half of it, and the full episode you can find at razib.substack.com, and if you subscribe, you can listen to the rest of it. Hey everybody, this is Razib Khan with the Unsupervised Learning podcast, and today I am going to be talking about 3 papers in Science magazine that came out on the Indo-European question, the Southern Arc hypothesis. The papers are mostly out of the David Reich's lab, although they had a lot of collaborators on these papers, so, more power to them. The papers are The Genetic History of the Southern Arc, A Bridge Between West Asia and Europe, The Genetic Probe into the Ancient and Medieval History of Southern Europe and West Asia, and Ancient DNA from Mesopotamia Suggests Distinct Pre-Pottery and Pottery Neolithic Immigrants into Anatolia. I'm not going to talk about the last paper too much, because I think it's a much narrower scope than the first 2 papers, but it's interesting as it is, and it points to the fact that these papers are really, really centered around Anatolia. Anatolia, also known as Asia Minor, today the modern nation of Turkey. It was the heartland of the Byzantine Empire for many, many centuries. Before that, there were other people like the Lydians and the Hittites, and we're going to get into the Hittites. So it's a very ancient part of the world. A lot of history has happened, and that's one of the reasons why we're talking about it. So the Southern Arc basically seems to me, as Joseph Lazaridis and his co-authors describe it, is basically the Eastern Balkans into Anatolia, into the Caucasus region. So the Caucasus between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. Really, it's kind of the southern 2/3 of the Black Sea. So the western coast, the eastern coast, and the southern coast, but not necessarily the northern coast, which is that north of that is the Pontic Steppe, which we will also talk about. And so the Southern Arc hypothesis, the Southern Arc model, basically posits that this region of the world was really, really a big deal in terms of the ethnogenesis and the emergence of the Proto-Indo-European languages and the Proto-Indo-European people. I'm a little reluctant here using terms like Indo-European because they also use terms like Indo-Anatolian. There is some arguments whether the Anatolian languages, Hittite, the Hittite language, I think the language's name for the Hittites themselves is Nasili. They are from the city of Nessa, so I just want to make a distinction between the exonym and the ethnonym for you nerds out there. So they didn't call themselves Hittites; they were the people of Nessa. Hittites is a name that derives from the Hatti, a pre-Indo-European people that were dominant in central Anatolia in the 3rd millennium BC. And then there's also the Luwians to their south, mostly, Palaeans to their north, and then to their west, like in the corner, there are Lycians, I think. And so these languages are the Anatolian languages, and there are no Anatolian languages left today. They all went extinct. They were absorbed with Hellenization during the Iron Age, but they were a big deal during the Bronze Age. And the earliest written Indo-European that we have is Hittite. They adopted the Akkadian cuneiform script, and they used it for their language, I think 1950 BC. If I remember correctly. So that's really, really early. And the issue at the heart of these papers is several years ago, they got some samples from Hittites. They were buried in a way that seemed like these people were Hittites archaeologically, so you assume that they are Hittites. They are Nessa, people from Nessa, not Hatti. And these 2 samples were interesting because, in 2015... and the last couple of years, basically between 2015 and now, a bunch of papers have shown a strong correlation between Pontic Steppe ancestry from the Yamnaya people. Yamnaya means pit grave in Russian, because they buried their elites in pit graves with vast mounds called kurgans. And all of the Indo-European people seem to have this sort of steppe ancestry. And you kind of saw this even before you had ancient DNA. I think I've said this to many people, and I'll say it again. About I don't know, 2010, I started noticing a weird pattern of in admixture analysis, which is model-based clustering. You use these populations, these ancestral populations, and you see how different populations are linear combinations of these ancestral populations. A Caucasus type ancestry, Caucasian type ancestry, seemed to be more prevalent among Indo-European speakers than non-Indo-European speakers in particular localities. So, for example, if you compare Basques to their French neighbors or their Spanish neighbors, Basque are not Indo-European language. I thought that was suspicious. In the Indian subcontinent, you could see this contrast as well. This Caucasus type ancestry was present in the north and the west in upper caste populations, and then you also saw some association with Northeast European clusters in the Indian subcontinent, particularly again the north and the west in upper caste populations. This is all weird, okay? So it was all suggestive until you had ancient DNA. And what happened, I think it was like 2013, 2014. David Anthony, an archaeologist, gave a bunch of samples to David Reich's lab. They genotyped them, and they were shocked that these people from Russia, I think some of them were sampled from Russia, and some of them were sampled from basically the eastern half of Ukraine, east of the Dnieper. The Yamnaya people did push west, but really their core is between the Dnieper and the Don River. So they span Ukraine and Russia, modern Ukraine and Russia, the Pontic Steppe. The ancestry of these people is just found all over the world, okay? Europe, Iran, the Indian subcontinent, Mongolia. I mean, I did like a back of the envelope calculation, and this is in my Substack. You can find it in the archives. I think I estimate about 10% of the world's population has Yamnaya, pure, if you talk about pure Yamnaya, whatever that is, 10% of the world's population has that, right? From the Indian subcontinent to Europe to, diaspora populations in the New World, et cetera, et cetera. I ran the math, I did a weighted calculation, and that's what I got. So this was a big deal, and it was a big deal because it vindicated and validated the crazy ideas of this woman named Maria Gimbutas, a Lithuanian-American archaeologist, mentor, an advisor to people like David Anthony, J.P. Mallory. She had this idea that these kurgan mounds, so these big mounds that started spreading about 5,000 years ago from the Pontic Steppe into Europe, that they were somehow associated with the spread of Indo-European languages, patriarchal sky god systems, into a matriarchal Europe, what she called Old Europe. So she was partly wrong and partly right. In fact, she was very, very wrong and very, very right. There was actually no mildness in between here. The very, very wrong part is she thought that the old Europeans were matriarchal and peaceful, and it was the age of Aquarius, but actually we have plenty of evidence now from Neolithic Europe that they were extremely brutal, patrilineal, and that they engaged in genocide and internecine warfare. We're talking a butchery of whole villages of people of the same broad ethnic, right? So, there's mass burials of children, women, men, everybody, old, young, babies, etc., of these old Europeans, these Neolithic people. The earliest is the linear potter people in Germany, the people that created Stonehenge in England, and a lot of these enormously complex village societies in Europe between 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. Really, they peaked about 5,500 years ago or so, and they kind of went into a crash about 5,000 years ago. And this is exactly the same time as the Kurgan people came. Now, David Anthony and perhaps even Gimbutas herself assumed that this was spread of an elite culture, kind of like how, I don't know, Spaniards spread Roman Catholicism in the Philippines, or Islam was spread by Gujarati and Arab traders in Indonesia. There was not that much genetic imprint, but there was a huge cultural imprint. And so the assumption was, and if you read the Horse Wheel of Language, it's pretty clear that maybe a couple of percent of the ancestry is replaced, but this awesome new cultural package spread, and it was through conquest by this martial elite. It turned out this was wrong. The ancient DNA is quite clear that in much of northern Europe, they replaced the indigenous Neolithic population, who were very, very violent and warlike, as I know, But the newcomers themselves were violent and warlike. There's evidence in Poland of mass graves, probably of the native globular amphora people and the incoming Yamnaya. And, two go in and one comes out kind of thing, right? It's animal competition in this period of history. So it was pretty shocking to David Anthony. It was shocking to most archaeologists. It was shocking to the geneticists. So we're talking replacement on the order of about 3/4 or to 2/3 to 3/4 in Northern Europe within a century or so. So that's a massive replacement. Instead of 1 or 2%, we're talking 65 to 75%. And this is all across Northern Europe. It kind of dilutes as you go westward. So by the time you hit France, it's getting closer to 50%. In Spain, it's closer to like 40%, etc. But I mean, that's still a lot. That's still a lot of ancestry. It's still a lot of heritage for late Neolithic, early Bronze, and Copper Age people to just bowl over entire populations like that. So this was Europe. There's also the issue of the Indian subcontinent, and there's a paper in Nature Communications called Saga et al. 2020. You guys should look at it. I'll put it in the show notes. Basically, it shows a pretty clear transect of Indo-Iranian people from basically the region of the Pripyat Marshes, eastern corded ware populations. And I've talked about this. Most of you guys know this. They go eastward along the wooded steppe woodland, north of the Pontic steppe, south of the boreal forest, where they're Uralic people. They keep going eastward. They eventually hit the Urals, and in the South Urals, they became this highly militarized people called Sintashta. Again, they start killing each other, and then they start expanding into something called the Andronovo Horizon after about 1800 BC, and eventually it looks like they come to Iran and the Indian subcontinent. And so, depending on your estimate, I estimate that about, what is it, like 15% of the total ancestry in the Indian subcontinent is from these Sintashta people. And so what I did is, again, I broke down the ethnic groups and the castes, and I did like rough numbers. I think 15% is okay. It could be 10%. I doubt it's above 15. So let's say 10 to 15%. Now, this is a very small minority, but here's the thing. There's a lot of people in the Indian subcontinent. So that's still a substantial number. In the Northwest, it gets much higher, like closer to 25%. In some castes, it's maybe 30. Again, it depends on the parameter settings in these models. People argue over a lot of things, but really what they're arguing over is like 5%. It's not really, to my opinion, it's not really worth it, right? So, this was all a big deal, like going from the Bay of Bengal to the Atlantic. We've solved Indo-European question and Indo-Europeans. They're from the Pontic steppe, right? And who are these people? David Anthony has written extensively about it. Other people have as well. There's books on Indo-Europeans you can find. It looks like they are a mishmash, a mix of indigenous Northeast European hunter-gatherers. They're called Eastern hunter-gatherers. And basically people maybe from the Caucasus region to the south. Caucasus hunter-gatherers, like very, very original, right? This is the original thought. And so Eastern hunter-gatherers have some affinity to the Ice Age people in Europe, in Western Europe, right? But they're also much more closely related to people in Siberia, ancient North Eurasians. So it seemed like the solution was in these ancient people, Eastern European hunter-gatherers, with Caucasus hunter-gatherers. They fused sometime before 3000 BC, and then they eventually expanded across the world. But there's a problem. So this signature is found everywhere, pretty much, where they, in the early period, where they speak Indo-European languages, right? And it's associated with particular Y chromosomal lineages, particularly R1b and R1a. These are obviously Paleo-Siberian lineages that spread westward and later spread all over the place. Okay, it's a pretty airtight solution to the issues at hand. But there's a problem. There's a couple of Nessa from Nessa, right? These are Nessite people, Hittites. We know they're Indo-European because we got their language earlier than any other Indo-European language. And they don't have any steppe ancestry, right? And I think there's like a couple of samples. And I remember talking to a friend of mine in the Reich lab, and I was like, what's going on with these samples? Like, there's no steppe ancestry. They're Indo-European. They're very early. They should have a lot of steppe ancestry. And, he said, well, we wonder if there's a sample mix-up. And that happens. Related to this, there's a paper about Polynesians before 1492 in Brazil. I guess I'll just say here, my old boss, Spencer Wells, was just like, that could be a sample mix-up. There's a lot of samples being tested in the world. from museums, and a lot of it could be, not a lot, but some of them are going to be sample mix-ups, and those are going to be very, very interesting to a lot of people. So, it's not a crazy idea. But these two papers, the two papers in particular that I mentioned earlier, The Genetic History of the Southern Arc, a bridge between West Asia and Europe, and A Genetic Probe into the Ancient Medieval History of Southern Europe and West Asia, they basically confirm there's no way this is a sample mix-up, because I think the total number of new samples is 700 or something ridiculous, ancient DNA. But they have a lot of Anatolian samples from Asia Minor, Anatolia, from these core old Hittite lands. They don't have steppe ancestry. What's going on here? And as I said, the Anatolian languages themselves are not just one. It's not just Hittite. It's not just the Nesite language. There's Palawan, Luawan to the south, and then Lycian. It's Lycian. And there's some suggestion that maybe Lydian from the Iron Age is a descendant. These Anatolian languages did persist actually into the Common Era, or Christian Era, depending on what you want to say. There are still some people that were speaking them, but they really faded in the Iron Age. But by the end of the Bronze Age, they were the dominant languages. Before Hittite was the dominant language in central Anatolia, though, the local people were called Hatti. That's what the term Hittite is from. They spoke a non-Indo-European language. It's an isolate. It's not related to anything else. And so we have in this area of the world a lot of linguistic diversity. So to the east of the core Hittite zone, there's stuff like the Kingdom of Urartu. There's a lot of non-Indo-European language speakers to the south of the Luawan zone. So the Hurrians, that's not Semitic. It's not Indo-European. It seems to be related to the language of Urartu. There's almost certainly, besides Hatti, there were other non-Indo-European speakers in Anatolia. So I think the Kaska, the Kingdom of Kaska to the northeast of the, basically where Trabzon is today, right? The northeast Turkey. So this is a really linguistically diverse area, and there's a lot of Indo-European languages. And one thing you see with the expansion of Indo-Europeans elsewhere is they replace a lot of the diversity and they absorb the substrate, right? So what's going on here? So there have been Russian, in particular, there have been Russian historical linguists and philologists who have argued that actually the Indo-European languages may have spread from Anatolia. This was actually picked up by Colin Renfrew, the archaeologist, and he argued in the 70s that Indo-European is a language that was spread by agriculture to Europe with the first farmers, and that's why it's so dominant. That's probably almost certainly wrong, 99.99%. The first farmers are from Anatolia, but it doesn't look like they're associated with the spread of Indo-European. It looks like they're associated with the spread of something else. The Pontic steppe thesis looks more plausible than this older idea of really ancient spread, right? But there was still the possibility that the Pontic steppe might have been a secondary spread zone. That Indo-European originally came from elsewhere, and then it really spread via the Pontic steppe. So think about the Germanic languages. They're all over the world right now. It's Germanic languages are the dominant second language in the world, right? But it's not German. It's not Norwegian. It's not Swedish. It's not from the core Germanic zone. I'm talking about English. English spread to Britain. Bretagne, right? The land of the Britons, the Britanni, and it overwhelmed the island, and then eventually England became a colonizer nation, a settler nation, and it spread this I don't want to say marginal, but this atypical Germanic language all across the world. And so my point here is, we know where the Germanic languages kind of come from in Europe. They come from maybe the Jutland, southern Scandinavia, northern Germany area, probably. They probably come out of the corded ware zone, thousands of years ago. I think the Unesta culture, I can't pronounce it. Anyway, we kind of have an idea. They don't come from England. England was probably not Germanic. I don't care what Stephen Oppenheimer says, but, that's where they spread to all across the world. And so there was always a suggestion that maybe the Pontic steppe is like that. I'll cut to the chase and say that this is pretty much what Yosef Lazaridis and his co-authors believe. They now are claiming this is not a case closed, okay? I want to be clear about this because people are very, very emotionally involved. I don't know why. Well, I kind of know why, but I don't want to get into that. But, this is a serious, creditable argument. It's not crazy, okay? But they believe, Lazaridis and his co-authors believe that the Indo-European language probably spread from maybe eastern Anatolia, the Caucasus, maybe northwest Iran. They don't have perfect sampling, so they're not 100% sure. And they think that it spread westward into Anatolia, into central and western Anatolia, okay? And then it spread northward 5,000 years ago into the Pontic steppe. And from the Pontic steppe, it spread into a lot of different places. And that's why the steppe ancestry is all over the place. Whereas in Anatolia, there's no steppe ancestry because these Indo-Europeans did not go via the steppe. They went straight from the Caucasus or whatever to the east of Anatolia region they're from into Anatolia. And so within the Indo-European linguistic phylogeny, there is a thesis that the Indo-European languages, Anatolian languages split out first. So that's why the term Indo-Anatolian exists. So it's an outgroup. If you guys think in terms of phylogeny, this is where actually like this podcast should be on YouTube for once. But in any case, Anatolian is the outgroup. It's the basal order, like with Hittite and all these. And there's a lot of Hittite. We have a lot of Hittite tablets. Most of them have not been translated because no billionaire has decided to fund it. Like billionaires, think about it. There's a lot of untranslated Bronze Age tablets. In any case, so we have a lot of documentation. Like the Anatolian languages are clearly outgroups compared to all the other Indo-European languages. So let's like name off the families, right? We got Anatolian, we got Tocharian, which is extinct. It was in Xinjiang, mostly historically it's in the northeast corner, Turfan in that area. And then you have Indo-Iranian. These are Indian languages, Indo-Aryan languages and Iranian language are clearly a natural sister clade. Okay, in terms of like, there's no debate about that. And then you have Balto-Slavic. There's a little bit of argument about this because some people say, oh, it could be just like lexical exchange, like, instead of like real genealogical connection. Who cares? Whatever. There's some people who argue that Balto-Slavic and Indo-Iranian are a clade. A lot of historical linguists disagree with this. I think it's probably right because these two lineages historically share the same Y chromosome. Dominant Y chromosomal lineages, R1A, where it's like the diverged mutation between the two branches dates to about 3,500 BC or so, 5,500 years, right? So I think that that's plausible. And then you have Celtic, Italic, that might be a clade, although that's more tendentious. And then you have Germanic, obviously, Greek, Armenian, and then you have the weird Illyrian ones like Albanian and extinct ones like Thracian and stuff like that, right? So you have all of these Indo-European languages. One thing that this new model suggests, though, is basically, in some way, all of the Indo-European languages, except for the Anatolian ones, are probably connected to the steppe. They're probably connected to the Pontic steppe. And the Pontic steppe itself, Lazaridis et al., I kind of agree with him here, and I had thought this before. There's several daughter cultures out of the Yamnaya. So the Yamnaya are about this 50-50 mix between Caucasus hunter-gatherer, like West Asians, and indigenous Northeast Europeans, right? And but they spread out and mix with other people or don't. So there's a culture in the Altai in Mongolia called the Afanasevo that shows up like a century. It's like 3,100 BC, really early. They have no mixture with any of the intervening populations. It's like they just took their carts and went straight east until they hit the Altai pastures. They are carbon copies of the Yamnaya of the Pontic steppe. I think like David Anthony has claimed that, I think he's on a paper that will come out at some point with many, many more Yamnaya samples. They found relatives of people in the Altai to people in Western, like in Hungary and stuff. Like basically they're cousins, right? So these are one Yamnaya people, these nomadic people. Some of them seem to have gone north and west into the woodland zone, modern day Belarusia, Poland, that like area of Russia, south of Novgorod. And they became the corded ware people, and that's basically, if you read my Substack, I have a post on them, but basically it's their pottery. The idea is their pottery is actually recapitulating baskets, because, nomadic people have baskets, they don't have pottery. But when they settled down and adopted agriculture, they basically, recapitulated their baskets into pottery. And so the corded ware people are in northeastern Europe, and they show up really early, like 2900 BC, 2850 BC, as a distinct population. Genetically, they're overwhelmingly Yamnaya, but they have a large minority ancestry of other things. So some of them seem to have like residual amounts of like extra Eastern hunter-gatherer, like maybe 5 or 10%, something like that. But the main thing to note about the corded ware is they seem to have swallowed whole the globular amphora culture of Poland, of Eastern Poland. And this is the last great Neolithic culture. It descends from ancient early European farmers that descend themselves from Anatolian farmers that arrived in Europe, in Greece like 9,000 years ago or even earlier. And in Northern Europe, like I think like 6,000 years ago, a little earlier than 6,000 years ago, like maybe 7. In any case, so these are Neolithic people. They're the last ones before basically being swallowed up by the Yamnaya, who became the corded ware. It looks like the vast majority of Europeans today that have this Indo-European ancestry, they have globular amphora ancestry. The globular amphora just were absorbed into these European populations, these European Indo-European populations, probably mostly women, probably mostly female mediated. Probably the males were. So I2 is a haplogroup that was dominant among the globular amphora, and it's really, really low frequency now in Poland. What's high frequency is R1A. Earlier there was some R1B as well. These are Indo-European lineages. So Indo-European men came in, Yamnaya men came in from the Pontic steppe, and they basically bowled over the last farming societies here in Northeast Europe, created the corded ware. This is the earliest non-steppe Indo-European population in the woodland zone. Probably practicing agropastoralism. I want to be clear that these people were kind of primitive, to be honest. They're barbaric. The villages, the vast villages, and the beautiful pottery, and all these things that you see in Romania with the last Neolithic cultures and the vast megaliths. Like J.P. Mallory, great Indo-Europeanist, told me, the archaeology of the early Indo-Europeans in Europe, of the Yamnaya, corded ware, all these people, is focused on pottery and burials because that's what they got. So I think they probably lived out of wagons. They didn't really create permanent villages. They probably had some, simple huts, but they were destroyed very easily. In contrast, like the Neolithic people, they had a phase where they lived in these vast long houses, patrilineal lineages. In Romania, Moldova, there was a vast village culture that produced beautiful pottery. Just look it up. Again, it's in some of my Substack posts. But anyway, so you have this population in Europe, and this corded ware population seems to have and we don't have like perfect sampling. Like for example, their Y chromosomal lineage is totally different than the Yamnaya, and so it looks like there was some sort of turnover, or there were different branch that were previously unsampled. It's R1A, not R1B. Later, they move westward, and it looks like they mixed with Neolithic people in Western Germany in the Rhine River Valley, and from that arose the next great Indo-European population in Europe, and that's the Bell-Beakers. And the Bell-Beakers push into France by I think 26, 25, 50 BC, and then into Britain after 25, Spain by 2400, 23, Italy maybe a little later, but similar period. And so they bring this steppe ancestry all across Europe. It's found in Basques. It's found everywhere. And so, but they were not corded ware. They were somewhat different. They had a different Y chromosome that indicates they're a different cultural group, I think. And probably, if I had to bet, Bell-Beakers, they gave rise to Italic, Celtic languages, that sort of thing. I don't know about the Germanic. Could be a mix of some sorts of Western corded ware with Bell-Beaker. Corded ware cultures, though, probably Balto-Slavic and Indo-Iranian for sure, the old classical corded ware. And so, as I said, some of them went eastward and became the Sintashta, became Indo-European. So this is the big story, in my opinion. It's most of the story. So that hasn't changed by these new papers. What has changed is I think it's filled in some details about Armenian, Greek, the Illyrian, Paleo-Balkan languages. Albanian is the remnant, but there were definitely others. Maybe Tocharian. There's evidence, I think, it's still circumstantial, but there's a fair amount of evidence now that Tocharian, which is probably the next outgroup after Anatolian, it was spoken, in Xinjiang, in China as late as around 900 AD. Probably Tocharian is descended from the Afnasivo, who were this Eastern Yamnaya branch 5,000 years ago, and so that's why it's distinct, right? But in terms of the other groups, with Armenian, basically what Lazaridis et al. Are claiming, and the evidence for the Armenian in the paper is very strong. It looks like the Armenians have steppe ancestry. The early people in Armenia, they might not have been Armenian themselves. Whatever. It's post-Urartu, right? They're the new Indo-Europeans show up in the region of southern Caucasus, eastern Anatolia, and they have steppe-type ancestry. They have eastern hunter-gatherer ancestry. That ancestry drops over time from I think the late Bronze Age that's fine. I think that what's happening here is like this is a highly dense zone. There's that mixture, and so the steppe ancestry is being diffused everywhere. In any case, these people they have R1b lineages that are clearly Yamnaya. And the Yamnaya have a very distinct R1b lineage that's different than the common one in Western Europe that spread with the bell beakers. So it looks like these are not from corded ware people. So the corded ware is the branch that went right to the north, and it spread all into Europe, into Western Europe, Northern Europe, and then an eastern branch went into the Indian subcontinent and Iran and Central Asia. Right? Like they eventually overwhelmed.